So just an introduction to myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nikki Hardwick. I'm a human resources consultant with HR Talk, or for HR Talk. I head up the human resources division. And today I'm going to be presenting this webinar on the Christmas party. So the main reason for the webinar today is I've had numerous queries over the last couple of weeks regarding Christmas parties and specifically, events around Christmas. Obviously, it relates to numerous events that we have during the year, but the Christmas party is generally quite a big one. And interestingly, this year, we've had a number of queries regarding policies, regarding what is expected, and what are we as employers required to do, and where are we responsible for the behavior of employees from a Christmas party perspective. So I'm going to do, there's not a huge amount of information relating to Christmas parties in terms of legislation. So there's no legislation that specifically deals with events at a workplace, but I will be dealing with Occupational Health and Safety Act as well as harassment, which is probably the closest that we can get to in terms of what is our responsibility as an employer and what are we required to do. As I had said previously when nobody could hear me, if you guys do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section. And then as we go through, I'm more than happy to answer those. If you do want to ask a question verbally, please raise your hand and then Charlene will unmute you. But as we go through, hopefully I'll get to asking or at least answering some of your questions through this presentation. So if we just go through, so we begin. So the fun of the Christmas party. So as we get into, this time of year, everybody starts feeling all festive. We're now in a scenario where, you would think that people are starting to, get into the mood of possible holidays and that sort of thing. But what happens is we have the Christmas party, and out of that Christmas party comes the fun. So it's all the booze, all the alcohol, all the very badly behaved people, and the day after the Christmas party, there is just and this is obviously poking fun at it, but this is in a lot of instances people misbehave at Christmas parties. So the person who you were at 3 o'clock the day before is not the person who you are when you end up going to a Christmas party, and we end up with a number of really, really badly behaved people, lots of alcohol and that kind of thing. So where does that then leave us? Okay, so the pitfalls of the Christmas party is that there could be accidents. I've seen my fair share of Christmas parties where the drugs are there. So people doing cocaine in the bathroom, people misbehaving. Also the fair share of people posting inappropriate things on social media. So, there's a really nice one at the top there, obviously from someone from Burger King who posted, women belong in the kitchen. I didn't post all the comments from that, but obviously that, on the Burger King Twitter feed that's possibly not the best thing to be posting. And so what happens is at a work function, people start to believe that the work function is not really work, it's social, and they just misbehave. And so we end up with things on social media. Possibly people have had too much to drink or misbehaved or said something. We have people starting fights, the build-up of things that have happened in the year. And just we end up in a place where something that was supposed to be a celebration, that was supposed to be a well done, we've got to the end of the year, has now just ended up with Monday morning, and the HR person is inundated with complaints, grievances, harassment claims, or just generally people who come to work, feeling ashamed of what has happened. You told the MD, something that you possibly shouldn't have. You said something to a colleague that you wouldn't have ordinarily done. And so, in the place that, as employers and as HR people, the questions that we're starting to get is, what is my responsibility as the employer in relation to a Christmas party? What is my responsibility if somebody has too much to drink? Must I let them go home? Is it my responsibility to make sure that they get home safely? How responsible am I as the employer for the behavior of inverted commas adults? Where does my responsibility lie and where does it end? I don't want to be the person that is treating all these people as 5-year-olds. But very often we end up in a scenario where that's what we have to do. So how do we get to the point where we can have a nice celebration? And this really applies to any kind of event anyway, is any sort of social event. How do we get to a point where we can have a nice social event that doesn't end up with thousands of complaints and really unhappy people? So when I looked at this presentation, I really looked at the legislation that would govern this type of thing. As I said before, there's nothing in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, there's nothing in the Labour Relations Act that specifically mentions the responsibility of the employer in relation to social events from a work perspective. And so the 3 areas that I've kind of picked up on in terms of responsibility of you as an employer is, one is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now that has been around for many, many, many years. So I'll go through those with you in terms of what does the law say in your responsibility, specifically in relation to the safety of the employers and intoxication. The second one is the Code of Good Practice on Harassment. Now, a lot of you, if you've been to any of other webinars or attended the mini training, you will know that the Code of Good Practice for harassment was updated in March 2022. So it replaced the Code of Good Practice on sexual harassment. Now, in this code, which I'll go through just now, it is very clear what the responsibilities are of an employer in relation to their employees, as well as anybody that is doing business with the employer. So anybody that is there because of the business of the employer. And then finally, although this is not a legislation, is what is the social responsibility of you as the employer? If you're going to allow an event that you're allowing alcohol and next thing somebody has had, I don't know, a bottle of tequila, what is your responsibility as the employer when that person leaves? Do you have a responsibility? And this is not a legal thing, this is none of those things, but are you, do we as employers say we're not comfortable to allow that person to get in a vehicle and go? They're not safe, they're not, they shouldn't be driving. So where does our responsibility lie? And in terms of social responsibility, each organization is going to be different. My social responsibility and what I believe to be ethically correct is going to be obviously different to yours. So, but those are the 3 areas in which I think as employers, we need to start to look at. And when we look at social responsibility, is bearing in mind that God forbid something should happen at a Christmas party and there is an accident or somebody does die because they were drinking and driving. There's a much higher expectation of companies these days to have some form of social responsibility towards their employees. So this is not necessarily about me as Nikki, as the HR manager, what do I think? It's more about what do we as the company, what is our social responsibility to our staff? And so when we go into Christmas parties, I think the question is bigger than just what does the law say about what we need to do. So what do we want to appear to be doing if we go on social media? What is the message that we're wanting to come across when we're advertising who we are as a company? And so when you start to make decisions about what does our Christmas party look like, what does the social side of things look like? Are we just going to do away with an evening function? Are we just going to do a breakfast? I think all of those things start to play into what do we do as a company. Okay, so first things first, occupational health and safety. So this is not new. This has been around for many, many, many years and is actually in place in any sort of work environment. So when we look at occupational health and safety, specifically relating to intoxication, and I want to be clear that when we look at intoxication, it is not specific to alcohol. It actually applies in any sort of environment in which a person appears to be under the influence of anything that is intoxicating. Remembering that you could take cough mixture with codeine and it could affect you, and you could become intoxicated as a result of that mixture that you've taken. So what the legislation says is that any employer, or any user shall not allow a person who is or appears to be under the influence of intoxicating liquor or drugs to enter or remain at a workplace. Okay, so in essence, and you're also not allowed to, if we look at number 2, you're not allowed to keep a person at your workplace if they appear to be under the influence or have in their possession or partake of or offer any other person intoxicating liquor or drugs. Okay, so that is specifically in a workplace. But basically, in essence, what this is saying that as an employer, you may not allow that person to come onto the workplace or to stay at the workplace if they appear to be under the influence of anything. Okay, so you have a responsibility from an occupational health and safety perspective to make sure that in the workplace, the person or the people are safe. So if you allow someone to come into your workplace and they appear to be under the influence of any intoxicating substance, and as a result of that, the person falls or they do something to injure somebody else, you as the employer would then be responsible if you'd allowed them to continue to work. If you look at subsection 3, it also does say that the medication that a person can take, also you need to take that into account. So I know we're not talking about medication today, but it's quite important that when we look at the context of this particular piece of legislation, is it puts on the employer a responsibility to ensure that no person continues to work or remains on the workplace if they seem to be under the influence. And remember, you don't have to necessarily do a breathalyzer. It specifically says there is someone who appears to be under the influence of an intoxicating liquor or drugs. So a question that was posed to me the other day was, what happens if my staff party starts and somebody arrives at the staff party, obviously having done a little bit of pre-drinks, and arrives there and they're completely intoxicated? Do we or don't we allow them to come onto or be part of the party? If we look at this particular section, and I'm going to talk about if your party is outside of the workplace, but if we just look at this legislation right now, is in essence, although it is a social event, none of those people would be there if it wasn't for work. So all of the people that have been invited to this event are invited because it is an event that has been organized by the workplace. They are there as a result of work. And if they didn't work there, they wouldn't be coming to your event. And so if we look specifically at this piece of legislation, as it says, you may then not allow somebody who appears to be under the influence of intoxicating liquor or drugs to enter or remain at the workplace. So there is a responsibility for you, if somebody arrives at your work function and they are under the influence of anything, that you need to tell them, obviously, that they must go. So we're looking at this, whether you choose to do it or not is obviously, your thing to deal with. But if something happens, there's a possibility that you could be held responsible. Okay. Moving then on to the next slide is when we look at the defining of a workplace. So I want to be clear as well, as we look at the defining of a workplace from a harassment perspective. And then we also, so the workplace is defined in occupational is a little bit different. Okay. So on occupational health and safety, a workplace encompasses any site where work is conducted for the employer. So they specifically talk about work, spanning offices, factories, construction sites, and various other venues associated with work-related activity. So the definition is broad and inclusive and does cover a wide array of work settings. And the argument is that, again, what I said just now, is people may argue that this function that we're going to, I'm giving you a choice whether you want to go. And my argument on the side is that if the person didn't work here, they wouldn't be coming to this event. So it is not completely a social thing. It's not a case of me speaking to a colleague and going, hey, do you want to go for drinks later? That is completely social. In a space where we're organizing a Christmas party or a function, whether it be a conference, a Christmas party, or whatever it is, the reason why those people are there is because the company, let's call it HR Talk has organized a function. We are inviting you as employees to come to that function, and they are going to be there solely because they're employees. So whether it's after hours or it's not after hours, it is not completely outside of the work environment. So as an example, if we're going to start to argue that point, if those people that came to the Christmas function, we went to a restaurant, and they behaved badly with an HR Talk shirt, and as a result of that, the company was brought into disrepute, you would have no qualms about going to them on a Monday morning and disciplining them at the function because they brought the name of the company into disrepute. So if we're going to go on that side and say, yes, at that space, it was a work-related function, then we've also got to the other side where we say, if we're going to allow them to drink, we also then have a responsibility because it's also a work-related function. Now, at a lot of points here, people start to say, Nikki, you're being really difficult. How are people supposed to have a little bit of fun? At the end of the day, as employers, there's a much greater responsibility on us. Like I said before, from a social perspective, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be allowed to have a few drinks. What I am saying is that as employers, I think that there's and we will be held accountable. I believe that as things start to go, there's going to be more responsibility on employers if somebody has a car accident after, if somebody, and we'll get into harassment, harasses someone. So in the old days, if what happened at a Christmas party happened at a Christmas party and it stayed there. Now there's a responsibility on employers to teach people how they're supposed to behave. And there's no longer an excuse, I did something inappropriate because I'd had too many to drink. That's no longer an excuse. And so when we look at a function that is off-site, I believe that there is a really good argument to say, like I've said, is that in as much as it is off-site, it could even be after hours. The reason why those people are there is because of work. They wouldn't be there for any other reason. Okay. And so from a policy perspective, which we'll talk about just now, is that I think that you as employers have a responsibility to possibly limit the amount of alcohol that you pay for, is teach people how they need to be behaving. But I go ahead of myself. Okay. So when we then have a look at the regulations, so this again is talking about the occupational health and safety, is the regulations also pertain to the employer's duty to ensure the safety of employees while at work. So obviously occupational health and safety relates to that. So if an employee is at a restaurant during working hours as part of their job, the employer remains responsible for ensuring that that person is safe. Okay, this responsibility extends beyond the physical workplace and includes off-site locations. Okay, so employees then should not be under the influence of alcohol or drugs if it could jeopardize their safety or that of others. Okay, so from an occupational health and safety perspective, it's possibly never been argued before, but there is within that legislation, it is very clearly specifically relating to intoxication. There is a responsibility on you as the employer to make sure that people are safe. So not just the person who's intoxicated, but if somebody behaves inappropriately, they should be removed, and people just need to, there needs to be limits, there needs to be a requirement for people to behave appropriately. Just as much as you would within, any other thing is to say, when you come to our work function, you're still supposed to behave. Okay, you can't swear at the MD. You can't, grab somebody's, behind and, give it a squeeze. We would still be holding you accountable for that, even though we're, at a restaurant. So the same thing applies to alcohol. Okay. Then we move on to harassment. So harassment, as I said, this particular code was updated in March 2022, and this is very clear. So I'm going to go through now with you harassment, remembering that harassment is an automatically unfair discrimination, and the responsibilities of the employer in this space are very clear. So harassment is obviously not allowed, and if as you as the employer are found to not have dealt with it correctly, you as the employer employer can be held liable for the actions of the person who did the harassment. Okay, so this important, but who can be a victim of harassment? So I haven't listed everybody, but it can be. So both employers and employers can be perpetrators and victims of harassment, but the following people can also then be a victim of harassment. Okay, so it's owners, employers, and they list a whole lot of people, suppliers, and anyone else having dealings with the business. Why is this important? Because if I go to a restaurant, as an example, and I book out the restaurant for all of my staff to go there, and at that restaurant, one of my employees, let's just say, sexually harasses someone or is racially inappropriate or whatever it is at the restaurant, that person who has been arrested, they are there because my business is there and they have dealings with the business. So I'm not going to go through the whole harassment thing, but if they make a claim of harassment and you are then called to deal with that harassment and don't do it, you can then, as I said before, be held liable for the actions of the person who did the harassing. Okay, so, and we'll go through it in terms of the code, but the code is very clear that you as the employer cannot just step back and go, well, sorry, it wasn't, sorry, it wasn't my fault. He'd had too much to drink or she'd had too much to drink. It was a social function. It was all meant in good fun. That no longer is an acceptable excuse. So you as the employer are required to do a number of different things to ensure that your employees behave appropriately. With that said as well, obviously employees, so that is quite important, employees at the function can also be victims of harassment and can also be perpetrators. Okay. Where are employees protected against harassment? So again, there's a number of different things of where they, and I haven't listed them all, but it includes a workplace, both public and private, in which people perform their work. And it is very specific, and it says work-related trips, travel, training, events, or social activities. Okay. So when we come to a workplace and there is a function that is there specifically because of work, a conference, a Christmas party, whatever it may be, employees are protected against harassment, even in that space. When we look at what is harassment, so there's a specific test. It is unwanted conduct which impairs dignity. It creates a hostile, intimidating work environment, and it obviously goes through a number of different things. And it is related to one or more of the grounds listed in Section 6.1 of the Employment Equity Act, which relates to race, gender, sexual orientation, age, marriage, ethnic and social origin. There's a number of different ones, but anything relating to harassment specifically comes from that specific area. And what is quite important is that in terms of the code of good practice, harassment can be one single event. It doesn't have to be repeated events. So at a Christmas party, when something happens, it may never ever have happened before, and 100% it happened because somebody had, done something, had too much to drink or whatever. Come Monday morning, somebody can come in and say, I want to lodge a case of harassment because of whatever. And they're allowed to do it because it doesn't have to be repeated events. I had an argument, well, I didn't have an argument, but I had someone challenge me to go, the Merriam-Webster dictionary says that harassment must be an elevating event or series of events that can cause harassment. Now, that may be so in the dictionary, but our code of good practice, which is what we're held account to, says that harassment can be a single instance. Okay. And often people will say, as you get to Christmas, Nikki, things must be so much better because people are obviously in a very festive mood. They must be, the stress of the year is all dissipating. And I have to tell you, Christmas time is probably one of the busiest times for us because people behave so badly. It is not just Christmas parties. People at the end of the year, for some reason, forget how to behave. Okay. And Christmas parties are one of the biggest things where people seem to believe that it is a free area. It is an area with no rules and regulations, and for some reason just behave badly. So, as an employer, you have that responsibility, which I'll go through now, is to teach people and to tell them what is expected. Okay. So I want to go through some of the consequences. I can see quite a lot of questions coming up, which I'll get to just now. What are the consequences of failing to adhere to the legislation? So I've got the two of them here. And again, I'm not talking about the social media consequences that, God forbid, something happens at a Christmas party and next thing it is plastered all over social media. Somebody posts something, I don't know, inappropriate and tags the company, whatever it may be. Somebody records something that is happening at your Christmas party and posts it. We all know what social media can do. And then there's the awful scenario where somebody gets in a car and drives home and has an accident and kills someone. Those are all the social side of things, the ethical side of things, which we need to, as business owners and as HR managers, decide what do we want that to look like for us? What do we want? What consequences are we willing to deal with should something like this happen? So if we look at occupational health and safety, much like any other piece of legislation, and just to be clear, occupational health and safety is a piece of legislation. Okay, it is an act, and failure to adhere to any act comes with penalties, which could be a fine or it could be criminal prosecution. So specifically in relation to this is if you don't comply, and it depends on what you haven't complied with, but there's either fines or, depending on how serious there could be imprisonment. Okay. One of the things that it specifically mentions in there is that where your non-compliance has led to the injury or casualty of an employee, inverted commas, under your watch, the employer could be liable. So if we talk about an injury on duty, if I came to work and I was under the influence, or I drank when I was on work, and I stood on a ladder and I fell off the ladder and I broke my back. If my employer can prove that I was drinking on duty, then there is no IOD claim because I was obviously breaking the rules. If I, as the employer, Nikki comes to work and she's taken some cough mixture, or she's had a Tramoset or whatever it is, and you can see that Nikki hasn't got all her faculties about her, but I continue to allow her to climb ladders and whatever, I, as the employer, have been negligent. And so if it went with workman's compensation and they found that I, as the employer, was negligent, I'm then liable for the medical expenses and whatever else comes through that. The same concept technically could apply at a Christmas party. Okay. If we then have a look at harassment, and I just want to be clear with harassment. So we've got a code of good practice on harassment. Now, the code of good practice tells us as employers how we should be behaving. So what do we need to do? Okay. If you don't comply with the code of good practice, the code of good practice isn't a piece of legislation that says here's the punishment. What the code of good practice does is it, though, refers to other pieces of legislation, and specifically in relation to this particular element, it refers to the Employment Equity Act. Now, employment equity, there are two elements to employment equity. The one is if you're designated, and I'm not going to go into that because that's obviously a very different thing, but there's another element to employment equity, which is the elimination of unfair discrimination. And that applies to every single employer in South Africa. Whether you have one employee or you have 5,000 employees, it doesn't matter. One of the elements of unfair discrimination is the elimination of harassment in the workplace. So the Code of Good Practice tells us what we need to be doing, tells us this is what you should try to do. If we don't do that and someone is then harassed, the test that's going to be done, if the person then goes to CCMA, so let's assume it goes down that, the test that's going to be done is to say, you, Mr. Employer, did you do what needed to be done in terms of the code? We gave you a code to tell you what you needed to do and what you should be doing. Did you do that? No, we didn't do it. Okay. As a result of your failure to do that, okay, so proactively is to do that, this person was harassed. Okay. Did you, once she was harassed or he was harassed, I keep saying she, but it could be both, it doesn't really matter, is as a result of this person being harassed, did you follow the process that we gave you afterwards? No, I didn't. So now, Mr. Employer or Mrs. Employer, we're now going to hold you liable for the conduct of the person that was harassed. No, sorry, let me say that again. We're going to hold you liable for the conduct of the person who harassed the employee. Okay, so you now, and you can be jointly and severally liable. So if we talk about the restaurant, and we talk about, in this example, HR talk, One of my employees harasses the waitress, the waitron, whatever it is at the restaurant. The restaurant doesn't deal with it properly, and neither does HR Talk. That person who was harassed then has the right to then go to CCMA and say, I want to hold both of them accountable because neither of them did what they were supposed to do. Okay, so I'm hoping that makes sense in terms of your obligations, but then where you are held liable is under the Employment Equity Act. Okay, so that is in terms of consequences, how you as the employer would legally be held accountable if you didn't do what you needed to do. Okay. Alrighty, so now if we look at obligations, okay, so in terms of Occupational Health and Safety Act, so again, I keep vacillating between your social responsibility versus your legal responsibility. I like to work within the legal responsibility because that for me is easy. Your social responsibility is dependent on you. It's dependent on what you want your business to be, what you think is acceptable and not acceptable. From a legal responsibility, occupational health and safety is a piece of legislation. It's very clear. It's black and white. We know exactly what it needs to do. So occupational health and safety says you are responsible for the safety of intoxicated people and those around them. Okay. Very clear. The only thing that you possibly, if you wanted to try and argue is where is a workplace? Okay, so you could probably argue, if you wanted to, that a restaurant after hours is not a workplace, inverted commas, it was a social event. My devil's advocate on the other side is I would argue to say, well, no, it's not a social event. It is 100% they are there because of work. The fact that it's after 5 doesn't really matter. You as the business are paying for the event. You're paying for the alcohol or some of the alcohol or the food. It is a work event. The harassment, the Code of Good Practice on harassment is very clear that in terms of workplace, a social event because of work is where people are protected. And so the same principle would apply with occupational health and safety. Just to be clear though, is if, for example, we have a work function and let's say the work function ends at 5. You guys, we're all going home. What you guys choose to do after that, this is now no longer a work function. It is now stopped. If those people that are now at the work function have chosen to stay, it then becomes a social function, much the same as if I was at work and I said to one of my colleagues, would you like to go for a drink after work? That is me as Nikki asking Charlene, do you want to go for a drink? It is not an HR Talk sanctioned function. It has got nothing to do with HR Talk. It is a completely social thing. If, however, I'm at a conference, it would be a different thing because the reason I'm there is 100% because of work. Okay, so I'm hoping this is all making sense. Okay, the obligations under harassment are, substantially larger. Okay, so what it says here, and I mentioned before with harassment, is there's a requirement to take both proactive as well as remedial steps. Okay, to prevent harassment. So one of the things that you need to do is to take proactive steps to prevent harassment. So when we look at Christmas parties specifically, one of the things that I would look at doing and is to be very clear is to, prior to the Christmas party, is to start to make people aware of what the behavior you're expecting to have. So you need to be clear with people that in as much as it's a social, inverted commas, function, you are still bound by the disciplinary rules and regulations. In as much as it is a social function, people who get too intoxicated may be removed from the event. We don't encourage, for example, drinking and driving. Please take an Uber. If you wouldn't allow, for example, excessive swearing in a normal situation, why would you allow it at your Christmas party? So start to share with people what you're expecting. And I know this is specifically with harassment, but it's in all, when we're going to share what we need to be doing is when we look at harassment specifically, is you start to say, what is racial harassment? What is sexual harassment? What do we expect of you as an employee when you go to this Christmas party? But how do I expect you to behave? And if you don't behave, what is going to happen? I've sat in many, many disciplinary inquiries where, rightly or wrongly, people have gone to Christmas parties thinking, woohoo, it's time to relax, let your hair down. We don't, this is no longer work. We're just, connecting with our colleagues and behave in an inappropriate way. They may make a joke that's inappropriate. They may touch someone, inappropriately or whatever it may be. And very often people don't know that the Christmas party is still work, if that makes sense. They believe it's completely social. And so anything they do there, they can't be held accountable because it was social. And for me, I think it's really important for you as employers to start to tell people that they can be held accountable, that following on from whatever happens at the Christmas party, they can be held accountable for their behavior. If they bring the organization into disrepute, if they are vomiting in the flowers outside the restaurant and make you look bad, they can be, disciplined. If they start groping everybody and, doing inappropriate things, they can be held accountable. So we need to take proactive steps to teach people what we expect. Okay, you need to put policies and procedures in place. We have to conduct training and awareness. Okay, so the designation of the individual to deal with harassment, that is more than just the Christmas party, but it is something that you need to do. And then afterwards, obviously, I'm not going to go into that, but counseling, treatments, etc., should be outlined in the policy. I think for me, the main thing is, as an employer, we have two obligations: is to tell people what's expected and to tell them what will happen if they behave inappropriately. Okay, so what I think you need to be doing, as I've said already, okay, so these are just some tips and tricks and whatever that I think you could do prior to the Christmas party. Is one, develop a policy on unexpected behavior at work functions. Be very clear in that policy. So don't mince your words. So be clear in terms of what is your expectation relating to intoxication. What is your expectation on, drugs, for example? I get that it's a social thing and that sort of thing, but you are actually still at work. You are at a work function and we're expecting you to behave, okay? We need to train employees on the conduct and create awareness campaigns on things like harassment, drinking or intoxication, and then specifically drinking and driving. You almost need to be telling people that it's unacceptable to drink and drive. Give them alternatives. So, there's Uber, there's, I don't know what all the different ones are, but give them alternatives. Also think about where you're going to have the Christmas party. So if you're going to have the Christmas party, for argument's sake, say at Festive, which is wherever it is, and your expectation is that everybody must make their way home, a lot of them are not going to Uber from that far away if you're in Durban North. So start to think about where you're going to have the function and how easy is it for somebody to get transport home. If it is not easy, what is your responsibility in terms of getting those people home? Are you going to hire a taxi? Are you going to make sure that they know how they're going to be getting home? Otherwise, you're going to create a scenario, especially if you're doing free alcohol, where people are going to get in their car and possibly drive home. Okay. My suggestion is don't allow excessive alcohol consumption. So an example of something that, my recommendation is never allow an open bar. Weddings, Christmas functions, it just never ends well. Is you can look at what is a ticket system. So you give people X amount of tickets. For example, let's assume they have 5. That is their tickets for the day. And a Coke would be 1 ticket. If they wanted to have a brandy, for example, that would be 1 for the brandy and 1 for the Coke. So the amount that they could possibly drink, if they wanted a double, you could have, then it would be 3 tickets. So they're now only going to have 1 and a bit drinks. They can try steal, beg, borrow from everybody else, whatever it is. And then you also limit what they're going to have. So I know that it feels like we're treating people, like children, but firstly, it's a fair system. And secondly, you're not going to end up with a massive bill because people are drinking Johnny Blue and Red Bull as an example. Okay. Possibly, if you can, is instead of spending all your money on alcohol, you budget into your Christmas party funds 100 Rand for an Uber or a Bolt or whatever, and you give people the ability to go home. We spend a huge amount of money on the food and the drinks and whatever. Take an element of that, and if you can, allow people to be able to Uber home. Okay, and then spend a few weeks before the party sharing the information on what is expected and the consequence of bad behavior. And yeah, so that really brings us to the end of the information that I want to share with you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now going through any questions that I've got. So Tom, you had the question of, does the definition include a restaurant hosting the work function? So as I've said, I think I answered the question, is it could very well be argued that it's not a workplace, but my argument would be, if I was going to challenge an employer, my argument would be, well, you're there because of work. So that would be the one. Again, Belinda, yes, I do believe the employer is responsible after hours. My argument there is, you're there because of work. Okay, they wouldn't be there if it wasn't because of work. Are the employers responsible? Is the employer responsible for the employees' partners too? I would say yes. So although they're not an employee, so from an occupational health and safety perspective, the definition of an employee is quite clear, is it is obviously someone who works for you. With that said, though, is that there's the other side of things, is that the harassment side. So you're allowing someone, and if we go to the definition of who can be a victim or a perpetrator of harassment, it basically, and if I'll actually try and go back to that slide, is it specifically says, hold on. So this definition here actually extends, a little bit more. It doesn't mention spouses per se, but it basically says anyone having dealings with the business. So if you're going to invite spouses and they behave badly, you may not be able to obviously discipline the spouse, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to discipline the husband or wife. But if that spouse does something, one, to bring your organization into disrepute, it's going to be an issue for you. But two, if that person harasses someone, you may have a problem because you do need to deal with it. I'm not entirely sure how that would play out. It's a very interesting question, but I think that we need to, in our communication with everybody, if you're going to be inviting spouses, then you need to be sharing with everybody the expectation of the spouse as well. Okay. Alrighty. We have a question. What can or should a company do if there's inappropriate consensual behavior? Okay, so for example, married people behaving inappropriately with a work colleague. So in that scenario, again, my question would be, is what would you do if it was taking place during work hours? So if in a staff meeting, so they were behaving in an inappropriate manner, what would you do in that scenario? What I would probably do is, the fact that they're married to anybody else is actually irrelevant. It's got nothing to do, with you. Is if it was during work hours and somebody, two people were flirting in the kitchen, or I don't know, doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, my question would be, with any sort of relationship, hey, one, I need you to understand that if you're going to do this, you don't do it during working hours. Other people, you need to behave properly because other people are here. And I would apply the same logic that I would apply if they were doing it in the kitchen or doing it at 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay. So I hope that's answered your question. Belinda has said, what happens if attendance is not compulsory? Again, I go back to is who organized the event. So who has decided to organize this event and to pay for everything? Okay. So you as the employer have organized to allow people to come to an event that you are paying for, and therefore it is a work-related function. The fact that you give people the ability to say, no, thank you, I don't want to be there, doesn't then detract that the people who are there can just behave like animals. Okay. The people who are there is still a responsibility for them to behave appropriately. The fact that you've allowed an RSVP doesn't mean that harassment can now take place because everyone's that's there. It's a free-for-all. All you've done is allow people who don't want to come to have the ability to say no, thank you. It doesn't change the nature of the event. Okay. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. Is there anything? Any last questions? I know we're not yet at 10 o'clock. Oh, there we go. Nelly, can you explain for me the dress code when it comes to workplace events? So a dress code is completely defined by you. Okay. Again, we go back to people believe it's completely social, and so it's a free for all. If I want to bring my cocaine or my weed or my, I don't know, whatever, or I want to wear something that is completely see-through, would you allow that in normal circumstances? So you wouldn't. You would not allow someone to come to work dressed in a certain way. And so you need to be saying to people, guys, this is the expected dress code. Are they allowed to wear shorts? Can they wear, I don't know, a costume? Must they be? So what is your dress code for your function? Remembering, if you're going to be going out, especially to a restaurant, you're going out as the company. You've booked it under your name. And so there's a level of expectation. You are going there representing the company. And so you have the ability to say, this is what I expect of you. I expect you to behave in a certain way. No, you cannot come in a bikini. Yes, you need to be dressed appropriately. Can you wear shorts? Yes or no? So define for people what the dress code is. It is still work. They are there and you are paying them to be there. Okay, my question would be is if they don't want to come, must they then put in annual leave? So it's still a work-related function. Okay, absolute pleasure, Tom. Are there any other questions from anybody? Absolute pleasure. Okay, so if anybody needs help with policies and that sort of thing, whether it's around harassment, specifically, Trevor, I'll get to your question now. If you need assistance with policies, please feel free to email us. You can email us at info@hrtalk.co.za, and then we're more than happy to help you. Trevor, you've got a question. If the function is at a central venue and employees are flying in, what can the employer do if the employee arrives at the airport intoxicated? Okay, so good question, Trevor. Again, I would be clear with people up front. So I would just tell them what the expectation is. So I would say, you are coming to Durban for a work-related, or Joburg, or wherever it is, you are flying in. When you fly in and you're coming straight to the Christmas party, please ensure that you're not intoxicated. Okay, so obviously maybe don't address it at one person, but tell them people are required to arrive at the event of sober mind. If anyone is intoxicated or unable, that firstly, they won't be allowed to attend the event, and you're going to have disciplinary action because they were intoxicated whilst on duty. So I would just be very clear in terms of what your expectation is. The only time that would possibly be different is if they were flying in, for example, at 7 o'clock at night with the Christmas party being the next day, 7 o'clock, well, they're going wherever they're going to go, and that's different. But if they're flying in to attend the Christmas party or driving to attend the Christmas party, if they arrive intoxicated, I'm going to discipline them because they're under the influence of alcohol whilst, inverted commas, on duty. The fact that they're in a plane is irrelevant. And just be clear on their behavior that is expected. Okay. Pleasure, Bridget. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Please feel free to email us, info@hrtalk.co.za. And I wish you guys all well for the Christmas season. I hope that as you go to the end of the year, it is successful, and that you do, if you're having Christmas functions, that they're good and they are stress-free and there are no problems. Thanks, guys. We will see you for the next webinar.